Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Hello, guys, and welcome to episode 38 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. And today we are talking about the award-winning book, The Unexpected Joy of Being Sober by Catherine Gray. And Catherine Gray talks to us about what she thought life would look like when she became sober after drinking for over 20 years. We talk about how sobriety helped her gain awareness in her life and what it was like for her to walk in these AA circles when she self-identifies as an atheist. And then we talk about getting sober amidst the coronavirus and some tools. She gives us a lot of tools to use when we have to self-isolate and also deal with our emotions and triggers. Yeah, and so I hope you enjoy the show. On to our guest, Catherine Gray. Catherine Gray is an award-winning writer and editor. Catherine's hit debut book, The Unexpected Joy of Being Sober, became a Sunday Times top 10 bestseller within a fortnight of publication. The book is witty, it's down to earth, and she leaves nothing to the imagination. She's very detailed about her journey and her struggles. And so I hope you enjoy this episode. Okay, here we go. Catherine Gray, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I thought we would start this conversation by inquiring about your spiritual background from childhood.
Okay, yeah, that's a great start. So I grew up in Northern Ireland, and both of my parents, my dad's now passed, and my mum, I'm pretty sure she won't mind me saying this, had been raised in very religious families, but my mum had been raised Catholic and my dad Protestant. So for a start, their relationship was quite taboo. And faith and religion and sectarianism was very much a part of my childhood. And I remember very clearly when I was about 6 or 7, begging to go to Sunday school because all my friends went and I felt like I was missing out. and then later on, I would go to church when I went to see my relatives, basically, and would have to be coached beforehand as to what to say back to the priest and all that sort of thing. So I guess I began feeling like it was a pretense, and I never truly believed it anyway. I mean, there's never been a point where I've had faith, and I haven't felt in any way bereft of that. So I literally never spent time really thinking about faith or belief or higher power until recovery, which just seems so strange given how my parents got together and also being raised in Northern Ireland, where it's at the forefront of everyone's mind. So that was the first time I really had to grapple with it and analyze it and think about it, and felt like I should believe even though I didn't, and felt like I was doing it wrong because I don't have a higher power. So it really came as a surprise, and also felt like an outsider in a lot of circles because I'm an atheist. So I just didn't expect there to be that link. Yeah. I just didn't know that it was going to happen. So it sort of sideswiped me, and I went through a lot of agonizing over it and reading books about it and trying to locate this higher power that I just could not find because I'd never had it. And you can't pretend to believe in something you don't believe in.
Mm-hmm.
So, or at least I don't agree with that. I think that's just fake. I mean, some people say fake it till you make it, but I don't get that. I just don't think that's authentic. So yeah, it was something that really dominated my thoughts in early recovery. I would say for at least the first year, I was thinking about it a lot.
Right. And it must have been difficult to go into those circles where you said that you felt like an outsider.
Yeah, it was. And, people were trying to help me find a higher power. Mm-hmm. There were so many suggestions that people said, read Waiting by Maria Hornbacher. I really apologize. I've totally said her name wrong, I'm sure. So they were sending me links to books and saying, oh, well, I'm not, my higher power isn't a celestial being. It's just this teddy bear that I own. Or, the whole famous, it can be a doorknob thing. Or somebody told me it could be a dog. And just... Mm-hmm. Everyone, I think they were just trying to do their best by me, because finding a higher power had helped them. And so therefore, when I said I didn't have one, I think it unsettled them, and therefore they tried to help me find it. And that unsettled me.
Yeah.
Because I was like, but I just don't, no matter what I did, I couldn't grasp it. It's just not something that makes sense to me, that something outside of you can get and keep you sober, which is literally how I think a lot of people do it and think about it. But for me, that I find that unsettling.
Right.
Whereas other people would find my way unsettling.
Right. And the higher power does help a lot of people.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And that's the thing. It's not that there's a right or wrong way. You just need to find a way that works for you. And the way that works for me is self-efficacy and what's called an internal locus of control rather than an external locus of control, which is where when you have an internal locus of control, you believe that if something happens, you've done it. And obviously there are many, many things we cannot control, as is unbelievably evident right now in the global crisis. But there are certain things I am in control of. And one of those things is whether I drink or not.
Right.
So I just don't understand how to think of it any other way. Whereas other people who have an external locus of control, they find it comforting to say, okay, it's my 12-step group or my smart recovery group or my higher power that keeps me sober. I think maybe if they shifted to an internal locus of control, they would think, well, I just can't do it. So therefore, I'm going to lean and draw from these other sources. There's no right way. It's just that people need to be given the wriggle room to find their way. And that depends entirely on what you believe and your psychology and what feels good to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, sorry, I don't think I answered your question. Your question was, how did I feel? Yeah. When I felt like an outsider in these situations. Yeah, I found people were very trying to be helpful and trying to say, this is how I did it. Maybe you do it this way. I don't believe in God, but I do believe in group of drunks. And my father was an atheist too. And I think he was 23 or 24 years sober when he died. And he was a big believer in 12-step, and it massively helped him. And he even helped write the alternative 12 steps. I think it's called AA Agnostica, the steps that are for atheists.
Yeah.
And, he was really involved in that scene. So he had a lot of suggestions for me. But at the end of the day, I just had to carve my own path. And once I stopped trying to do what everyone else thought I should be doing and tried to believe what everyone else thought I should be believing, that's when my sobriety started clicking, really, really clicking.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's a case of trying everything, seeing what works and keeping what works. But nobody can tell you how to do it. You just need to find your own path. So yeah, I felt very scared for quite a long time though, that I didn't have a higher power.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't understand why, and I found it difficult to find other people who felt the same way. Everyone in the Facebook groups that I was going to seemed to have some sort of faith.
Mm-hmm.
I was in a gratitude group. Everyone seemed to there was nobody there that was an atheist as well.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously in 12-step, I mean, even though there are atheist meetings, there were none in my area, and I lived in London at the time, so you know,
makes it difficult.
Hundreds of meetings in London, but there was none that I could find that were geared to me. And so even though I kept hearing, you don't have to do it that way, you know, it's just a suggestion that you have a higher power, then I would go to a meeting and hear, you have to have a higher power. Mm-hmm. So it just seemed that I was getting contradictory advice, and it was freaking me out. So it was only once I gave myself full permission to be an atheist in recovery and to stand up and go, look, I just don't believe in that. And that's okay.
Yes.
And the way I'm doing it is working for me. So I'm really glad that your way is working too for you. But that doesn't mean either of us are wrong.
Right. You don't need to convince me that I need to find my higher power. Right?
Exactly. I'm not going to convince you to not believe in your higher power. So let's just live and let live, and leave each other alone.
Leave each other alone. So Catherine, I'm excited that you're on. I want to talk about this book, The Unexpected Joy of Being Sober, which I believe was your debut book, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think it was published, do you know what? It was only about 2.5 years ago.
Oh, wow.
It seems like a lot's happened since then. So, I really didn't think I thought it would sell about 30 copies to my friends and family, and then it astonished me by becoming a bestseller, and it's sold loads in the States as well, actually. So it's startling. One agent that I went to see told me that nobody would ever buy a book with sober in the title. And it turned out they did.
They did.
Yeah, it's been lovely.
Let's talk a little bit about your relationship with alcohol. You share in the book, I was 12 when I started. As an incredibly nervous kid, I began to believe that relief resided in bottles, that great stories were at the bottom of glasses, that booze was anesthetic for my ever-present anxiety. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, and there's a huge link between people who start drinking before the age of 15 and later developing an addiction. So you're 4 times more likely if you start before 15 to eventually develop an addiction with alcohol. So I was just a very, very nervous adolescent and very uncomfortable in my own skin. And when I started drinking, I thought, yes, this is the solution. This is what makes me feel confident and feel like I can go to parties and talk to boys and all the things that I wanted to before. It just seemed to be this magic elixir that smoothed my jagged anxiety and made me feel like all was right with the world. And so I embraced it wholeheartedly. But it wasn't until university I was quite controlled about my drinking before university. I was sort of because I feared social embarrassment, and the few times that I did get really, really drunk, I felt embarrassed about what I'd done and didn't quite know what I'd done, and therefore that inhibited my drinking overall. And so I would generally limit myself to 3 drinks on a night out, but sometimes that would slide. But university was when I really started going for it, and I think a lot of people have the same experience.
Yeah.
I'm amazed I managed to get a degree.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then it just became part of my makeup. I was a drinker, and it was one of the things that people would have, if they said to them, list 3 things about Kath, they would have number 1 said she's a party animal or a booze hound or a barfly. It would have been top in their definition of me. But I was getting away with it in my 20s. I was calling in sick but still getting promoted. I was, overall, I managed to patch up the damage that it did. So it was really in my early 30s that it started becoming completely careering out of control.
Yeah, you make a good point where you say that you're able to patch up the damage you did. I feel like a lot of individuals, at least a lot of individuals that I talk to over the phone that may not end up making an appointment, start off by saying, well, I don't really think I have a problem. However, ... And then they start to list all of the negative consequences and all of the behaviors. And, it's tough. It's tough because you can't convince anybody if they don't believe it themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it is tough. You have to get to a point where you do see an issue there in order to address it, I think. But there's a big gap between the investigation. So I probably started Googling signs you have a drinking problem 6 years before I quit. So I probably started Googling that on private mode at 1 a.m. after a bottle of wine or more when I was 27, and I didn't quit till I was 33. So I think there's a lot of time often between those 2 junctures where you start researching it and thinking and worrying and secretly trying to moderate, and then failing and wondering why, and then getting to a point where you realize that, the consequences are completely blotting out any positives that were ever there.
Right.
And therefore detaching from it altogether. So I think it's a journey, and nobody can expedite it for you or pull you along out of it. That's why mostly interventions don't work. It has to be something you arrive at yourself. So but then it's a beautiful journey once you get there. Once you finally, that's the good bit.
It is a beautiful journey. Yeah. And it just like your title states. And I think that, before I read your book, I had never really thought about how, well, maybe I had, but not to this extent, how we really glamorize addiction and how it's, if you decide that maybe you need to quit, then there's something wrong with you, that you've done it wrong. Right? There's some sort of shame attached to it.
Yeah, you failed at moderating. I always find it really interesting how once people quit drinking, they're awarded a problem with alcohol. And yet the people who continue to drink are the ones who don't have a problem with alcohol.
Right.
So I try to steer away from that language, but I find myself slipping into it, the problem language. But because there's a saying that's, it's not those who quit who have the problem with alcohol, they found the solution. And it's true, isn't it? It's so topsy-turvy. You would never say, oh, so-and-so's quit smoking, they have a problem with smoking.
Right. There's just not that level
I'm still smoking, so I don't have a problem with smoking. It just doesn't make any sense. And yet we accept that because it's become so normalized and we've become conditioned to think of it that way. And in many ways, that way of thinking, the thinking that if you quit, then you're stigmatized, benefits the alcohol industry, frankly,
Yeah.
because it makes people want to hang on to the drinking because they think that if they quit, then there's going to be whispers. But that way of thinking has changed so much in the 6 or so years that I've been sober. The difference is unbelievable. And now I'm sure it's the same over there, but here in Britain, there's a real positivity around sobriety, and being sober curious. And it's no longer seen as something you need to hide away. It's something, it's seen as something to celebrate. And I think that attitude will die out more and more, that sober people should wear a stigma.
I think it's still pretty alive and present here. Actually, I did
really?
talk a couple weeks ago when we were still giving talks. And I should say that we're recording this in the midst of the COVID-19 epidemic. So, and the amount of people that were just surprised when I started talking about, Great Britain. I have a lot of guests on here from that area, and how that, their view of sobriety, mostly millennials, I'll say.
Yeah.
It's just, they don't want it. They don't have a need for it. It's nice. So that's interesting. So, I wonder if things have shifted here a bit forward, and then hopefully the attitude there will follow. Don't know. I hope so.
Yeah, but it's definitely shifted here. I mean, the way it's spoken about is very different.
That's good. So I thought we would talk a little bit more about the unexpected joy of being sober. Just maybe we could talk a little bit about what it was like once you found recovery. How did it help you gain awareness maybe in your life?
I mean, the first 30 days, something that everyone, I think, needs to remember, whether they're quitting themselves or they've got a loved one who's quitting, is that people don't say, I'm going to stop drinking, and then bam, it happens. They don't. It takes a while. And I read a study that said the average is 4 years, which is, my heart goes out to people who it takes that long, because it took 5 months for me, and it was hell. It really was, because every time I thought I'd got it, then it would slip out of my grasp. But also every time I drank again, I learned a new lesson. So I just applied that lesson. But I found that I was putting, 3 days together, 7 days together, 10 days together. So it was going incrementally up. And then eventually it just clicked. And I think the point at which it just clicked, I'd been going to AA for 6 months and not really connecting with it. I mean, I did find fantastic support there, and I did get things there that I still use to this day. But overall, I was having to leave more than I was taking towards the end of my going to meetings. And the month that I quit AA was the month that is now my sobriety date. So,
oh, wow.
But that's not to say that it's not a brilliant source of support for millions of people, because it is. But just for me, it was the right idea to peel away from it. And what I started doing instead of going to meetings was reading everything I could get my hands on, listening to every podcast I could find, which at the point was not very many.
Right.
I think I could only find 3 at the time. There was Bubble Hour, Home, but not in my very early recovery, and something else that I can't remember the name of since right now, I think. But anyway, now there's dozens of them, which is just so brilliant. And there's been a real explosion of sober literature as well, and blogs and all of that. And I joined a 100-day challenge because I didn't feel like 1 day at a time was doing it for me. That felt too tenuous. And I didn't want to say forever yet. So 100 days was kind of the good in between for me. So I joined that, and I joined a gratitude group because I knew that I was a naturally negative person, and I still am. If I allow myself to slip into it, I'm a worrier. I could, I almost make a sport out of worrying, and I'm quite anxious and I tend towards pessimism, untended, my mind just goes negative. It's just negatively biased, as most of our minds are. There's only a few of us that have what's called joyful amygdalas. And so I joined a gratitude group and I started exercising. I read a lot about how exercise helps nix cravings and also helps your brain repair from heavy alcohol use. So I started exercising daily and just gave myself the best possible chance by picking up every tool I could find, whether it was a book or a podcast or an app or a Facebook group or, trying to find friends on Instagram or whatever, and trying it all and then keeping what worked for me. So I almost treated it like I was studying for a degree. It was like a second job. I was literally spending about 20 to 25 hours a week on this. And some people say you should do that in the early days, that you should spend the amount of time that you would have spent drinking. And I definitely spent 25 hours a week drinking, because I was drinking 5 nights a week, sometimes 6, sometimes 7. And therefore I just threw all my energy at learning about it and learning how to do it. And that was the right approach for me. So it finally clicked. And just the first 30 days is so tough, but yet it's also so beautiful. It's like the most polar opposite of extremes. You just feel yourself. I remember just these massive highs of euphoria and crashing lows of despair. And now I know that that's because when your brain recovers, there's a lot of things that become regulated again, like dopamine production. So when you're addicted to something, your brain only really releases dopamine in response to it. And over time that becomes inhibited, but that's another story. And so when you quit, you start rediscovering pleasure in things that had no longer become pleasurable as the addiction tightened its grip. So things like music or a film or a run or a sunset or a bath or whatever, you feel like a newborn person, because you're like, oh wow, I really love this thing that I haven't been enjoying for so long, because the only thing you enjoy when you're deep in addiction is when you are feeding the addiction, and you're not even enjoying that. It's just that's the only thing you can focus on. And so it really felt like being newborn, and in many ways that felt very, very vulnerable, but also very beautiful.
Thanks for that. So I read in your book that you felt that community really helped you in recovery. And we've mentioned that we are in self-isolation right now with the COVID-19 epidemic. So for people that are starting to think about getting sober, or maybe they have started already, what would you say to kind of help them along in their journey?
Yeah, I mean, right now it's not easy to find community. You can't even see your family and friends. So, but actually I did go to physical meetings, as I've just said. I went to 6 months of that, but then I moved to online communities, and that was a better fit for me in the beginning, because actually I'm a massive introvert. I don't like speaking in front of rooms full of people. It's something that I've had to conquer now with my job, but naturally if I can avoid that situation, I will.
Catherine,
and so
Catherine, can I interrupt you 1 second? Was that something that you just discovered upon being sober?
Yeah, I mean, I remember telling a friend, now that I'm sober, I've discovered I'm an introvert. And she literally nearly spat out her tea. She was like, you're not an introvert. Because the drinking helped me act like an extrovert. And so I was the party girl. I was the one who was dragging people onto the dance floor and being really loud and cracking jokes. But I discovered that's not who I really am. And in many ways, I went back to early teens and started curling up with a book and preferring the company of dogs to people, and that kind of thing. So big group settings didn't work for me. I found it too nerve-wracking, and almost triggery, because I just didn't want to talk in front of 25 people when I was newly sober.
Mm-hmm.
I did it, but I would get so nervous beforehand and then really overanalyze what I'd said afterwards. And so when I moved to online communities, I found that much more like the balm that I'd been looking for. And then I was mindful. So I just trawled Facebook for sober groups, which obviously people can do now, even if they're on lockdown. And Instagram as well. There's huge sober communities on Instagram. If you just look for sober handles, there's hundreds of them. And yeah, I found my people that way, and that worked for me. And then I moved them into in real life. So then I met one-to-one with people who lived locally, which obviously will need to wait for people. but I talked on the phone with those people beforehand. So I would say for the first 2 or 3 months anyway, I wasn't really meeting up with people physically. I was easing myself into it, much as you would ease yourself into a cold sea. I was kind of getting used to it, and then before I had the confidence to dive in and actually meet them. And that way I've created really solid one-to-one friendships with other people who don't drink. And honestly, I found most of them through social media.
Wow.
But it took a lot of time. There was a lot of chatting and a lot of sliding into people's DMs and asking them if they want to go for a coffee. And yeah, it just worked for me. So, but then if you're someone that benefits from more of a group setting, then there's so many virtual meetings.
Yes.
They're all over the place. All you have to do is look for them, and they're there. And I know that almost everything's gone online now, like Smart and AA and Refuge and all of that. So it's there. And you don't have to go into a scary group setting if you don't want to. It's just whatever works for you. So yeah. And then when we come out the other side of this, which will hopefully be sooner rather than later, you'll have those connections to meet up with people in person. So yeah.
Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
So as we kind of wrap up, I'm curious to know what recovery looks like for you now.
Good question. Do you know, it's not really, and I'm just being completely honest, it's still my job and I still love being involved in anything recovery based. And I run this thing which is 3 months off called Sober Spring, and I'm still very, very involved. But personally, I don't really have to think about it anymore, because I don't know. I think the longer you are sober, the less energy and mental preparation and all of that it takes, and it just becomes the new normal. I don't have to resist cravings because I don't have any. I don't. It's just something that's become a second nature to me now. So that might be really reassuring for people who are struggling. But it definitely didn't look that way at the beginning. And even at 3 years, I still had to think and read and absorb sober stuff in order to keep my thinking straight. But I think when you get much further down the line, if you've laid those foundations early on, you don't really need to apply as much thought to it. So yeah, honestly, that's how it is. And whenever I do get unsettled by something, I think you have a choice. I think you can. So say for instance, at the minute, obviously everything is a bit crazy, and so I could interpret anxiety from the global pandemic as me craving a drink, but that's not what it is. I think it depends on how you see recovery. If you think you're always going to be addicted to it, which I do think that's true to a certain extent, because addictive neural pathways do live on in the brain, even though they're disused and now mine are covered in cobwebs. They're still there. So if I started to drink again, I probably would then start to drink addictedly. So from a neuroscientific point of view, that makes sense to me. But I don't interpret negative emotional states as cravings now. I just see them as regular emotions like anxiety or stress or anger or whatever it may be, and then I've got a bunch of tools to deal with them. So yeah, I think as you get later and later into recovery, you can look at emotions differently and not think, oh, this is me craving a drink. It's just about interpretation and perspective.
Yeah, it's good. Thanks for explaining that to our listeners. Any final thoughts, Catherine, as we wrap up?
On the atheist tip, I just want to, I'd want to say to people who are in early recovery, because I had a lot of, there was quite a lot of, when I read about people that couldn't find a higher power, there was quite a lot of stuff about ego and, thinking you're the most powerful thing in the universe. But that just doesn't compute with me, because if you're an atheist and you think, okay, I'm an ant in the cosmos, I live and then I die, there is no like greater meaning or purpose, and my body turns to ash, then that to me is more humble, if you see what I mean. So I would just say to anyone that's being accused of being egotistical, thinking they're powerful and not acknowledging how small they are, that actually in many ways being an atheist is acknowledging how small we are and irrelevant. So
nice.
Yeah, I would just counter that with that. We're not really that important. And that's okay.
And that is okay. So Catherine, how can people find you and the awesome work that you're putting out into the world?
Well, I spend quite a lot of time on Instagram. So my Instagram handle is @unexpectedjoyof. And I wrote a book, The Unexpected Joy of Being Sober. And there's also The Unexpected Joy of Being Sober journal, which is more interactive. So yeah, that's what I would say would be a fit for your listeners. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks again for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, Catherine.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.